I work in issues such as wetlands, botany, terrestrial ecology, rare species in Michigan, do a lot of technical writing as an ecologist, but I'm going to be talking really about sustainability today, which is a topic I've been working on for roughly 8 years. And I hope that this complements your understanding of sustainability as a topic, because you hear the word a lot now, and also sustainability of your particular organization, and along with that, sustainability of certain processes, and sustainability as you watch things happen on the planet. So this is a big topic, and you hear it all the time nowadays. But let's start. This is kind of important. Why just talk about something and just say it's important? Is it really true? Does sustainability matter? Maybe we can live in a state of constant flux and, you know, this is happening, now that's happening, now this is changing. So here's one way, maybe the easiest way I have to answer this question. If you try to think personally to yourself of something that's really important to you, like really important. I think of my health right away. I think of my kids right away. You know, satisfying career. Can be one or two things in your mind. And if somebody said to you, you can have that thing for 6 weeks, and then that's it. After that, everything's going to be changing. You know, you can have a satisfying career for 6 weeks, 6 months, and then after that it's always going to be changing, or it's going to slide away from you. I mean, I don't think anybody really wants to live like that. We have these sort of core values or desires. We want these things in our lives. We want to have them if we can, or we want to at least be able to pursue them. And in many cases, to pursue them, we need to be supported by institutions and systems and structures that are also sustainable and functional. So if your own health is really important to you, and our healthcare system is all messed up and too expensive, for example, that makes it hard for you to achieve your personal goal. So sustainability, we don't always think of the word, but it's, I think, deeply important to all of us. And I think we're starting to realize that as a nation and as a planet. Okay, so if sustainability is really important, then let's ask another important question. Okay, what does it look like? How do things behave when they're sustainable? What are their components? So when I see these questions to me are so big that I don't even know what to think. I can't even process these questions. It's kind of like, whew, give me something like that's, you know, small enough that I can think of in front of my face. I can process that. So I think personally and as a nation and as a planet, I think we don't really know the answers to these things. Sustainability is really a big deal, and you'd think that someone would have figured out just what that means, but I think if you look around at how things are going in politics and the economy and the environment, it's clear that we have not been practicing sustainability at all. It's very unlikely that you'd have a good argument that we figured it out. We can't even agree on, you know, how to behave together in the world. While we can, it is easy to design a simple thing sustainably. We could design a sustainable chair. That wouldn't be a problem. But when it comes to my local economy, my extended family, I want these to be sustainable. We lose our control, our understanding, and our leverage. So, and we certainly don't have instinct. So I think we have a long way to go in understanding what sustainability really is and what it really means. So if you had, all our ancestors lived out in nature, you know, a few thousand years ago. And if you were alive then and someone asked you what's the shape of the earth, what's the shape of the world, you'd probably say it's flat, or it's flat, it's got some depressions, it's got some hills. And that would be incorrect. And sometimes when you want to address a big question, you have to completely change your perspective. You can't see the answer to some questions from certain locations. So, to me, this topic of sustainability really matters, and I'm an ecologist. So, my approach was to begin thinking about nature. And I thought, well, nature is full of sustainable things. You know, I mean, no one really, I don't think of it that way all the time, but boy, it's got these natural systems. Beech maple forest there on the left, and a desert there in Arizona on the right, and an aquatic wetland in southern Michigan at the bottom. And it could be a jungle, could be a tundra, could be a tallgrass prairie. I've been in tallgrass prairies that have been there for, you know, at least 3,000 years. That forest has probably been there at least 5,000 years. Not those individual trees, but the same forest. Boy, that's a lot longer than anything I see most humans develop. And that's under the strain of a lot of internal competition, millions of interactions per second, a climate that they don't control, and other systems trying to essentially able to or willing to displace them, and yet there they are, doing the same thing year after year, and then century after century, and then for millennia, if the climate doesn't change too much. And why do they do that? Well, they have to. So natural systems, nature is constantly trying out things. New things are being born. Things are dying. There's different interactions happening all the time. Anything that's not functional in nature is gone immediately. Nature can try it 1,000,000 times, and if it doesn't work 1,000,000 times, it keeps disappearing. And if something isn't very sustainable in nature, it gets pushed out by something that's more sustainable. And nature is sort of, this biology sort of forces itself into sustainable configurations. And some people might think, well, nature's simple. Well, nature is probably more complicated. Natural systems are probably more complicated than human systems. Yes, they're simple in terms of technology, but not in terms of complexity. So, it's a strange concept. Where do you go with that? I've tried to develop a model to understand, okay, what would the sustainability be in nature, and what value can we gather from that? So I've looked for patterns in sustainable natural systems. That could be in a forest, prairie, any kind of wetland, whatever, aquatic, ocean system. And if I see that pattern repeating in a lot of places, I say, okay, that's a sustainable pattern, or that's a pattern that's at least workable in sustainable systems. And then I try and translate that into the human realm, because I don't want to give people a bunch of, you know, ecology or biology lingo that doesn't process into anything. So this is sort of the general model I've tried to develop for sustainability. And then I sort of push that a little bit further, and I try to translate those patterns into what I call the 7 human modalities, just all the ways my division of all the ways we operate economies, communities, occupational groups, governments, environments, cultures, and our bodies, physiology. And so I'm going to pause just really briefly and ask, at this point, are there any questions? Because I don't want to go forth with big misunderstandings. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the sort of the theory model idea. After this, I want to go into applications that would give you some things to think about that might have some relevance for your situations. Okay. All right, so I'll continue. I'll also add, some of you are aware of this book already. This model is presented in this book, which was published last year. And there are a total of 44 sustainability patterns kind of detailed in that book. So now I will go into what I hope are applicable concepts for organizations. I break them up into 4 sort of rough groups: forming an organization, operating, what I call larger forces at work, and management and innovation. So I'm going to cover a couple of topics under all these headings. Okay, so first topic under forming an organization, value. So when you are forming an organization, you're inherently asking for people to join in with you, at least temporarily, to agree with you or to formally join a group. And so how does nature handle this? How does this work in nature? These are all buffalo in the American West. On the right are buffalo near a wetland area, kind of a larger herd. There's a smaller herd wandering through the prairie, maybe in the Dakotas. And then on the left is a lone, maybe a lone male. Okay. So in many cases, we do find animals gather together in groups. It's very common in nature. Why would they do that? Why would they gather together in groups? Yep, protection is a big one, yeah. So if you've got many ears, many eyes, you can sense a predator way earlier. Maybe you can put your head down and eat, and you know your neighbor will see the predator. So it can be more safe, and there's strength in numbers along with that. So if a pack of wolves comes along, there are many individuals to fight off the wolves instead of just yourself. There are other reasons. It can help them make better decisions. They can learn from each other. They can divide up labor, like especially lions and primates tend to do, or a lot of animals do that though. And there are other reasons as well. So there are really good reasons to gather together in groups. So from that, and you'd think maybe, well, be in the biggest group possible. You know, why not gather together in the biggest herd? Well, then we have this little herd here, and then we have this loner here. What's the deal with that? Animals are not always in groups. And the reason is animals are really sharp to this. They have to be, because it's survival. Not only is there a benefit of being in a group, but there's always a cost. So if you're in the middle of a big giant buffalo herd and you're one of the buffalo, it's super duper safe, right? No predator is going to get to the center of a herd. And what's the grass like? Right in the middle of that herd. How many times has it been stepped on and chewed down before you got to that spot? So you might be really safe but really hungry after a while, being in the middle of that herd. And also, maybe the herd wants to go somewhere that doesn't really, isn't going to help you much. Maybe the herd wants to go to a water area and you don't need water, and that's 3 hours out of your way. Now you're going to take that time, you know, to go in that direction that doesn't really feel appropriate. So it's costs and benefits. And sometimes the costs and benefits fall out such that a smaller group works better. Sometimes a bigger, and sometimes being alone. But animals always gauge that, and they apply it. So in this topic of the value of this for people, as I see, is think critically about the groups that you're forming, or that in many cases I know they're already formed. But consider, just because something's a good idea doesn't mean that automatically even people that agree with that good idea are going to join in. So it needs to be, that group needs to be not only valuable, but more valuable than their other alternatives. And that last part says pattern 21 in book. That's just in case anyone's looking at this later and they want to reference it and read more about that pattern. Okay, so next topic under forming an organization, successional stages. So if you're forming an organization, you're obviously starting with nothing or just a thought, and then you want to end up later with some big thing that's working right. Okay, so let's see how system or community development occurs in nature. If you go into a forested landscape and clear an area completely, or if that area is cleared by maybe a devastating flood or fire event, in a healthy, natural forested landscape, that spot will reforest itself. But the interesting thing is, if you come back to the spot after like 3 or 4 years, on its way to reforesting itself, you will not find any of the species in the forest. It'll be full of plants, but there'll be all other things. And so these are stages, and I see them as 4 stages, which repeat all over the place in all kinds of systems. It could be a prairie, it could be a desert, doesn't matter. In the first stage, you get waves of kind of aggressive, short-lived species. This is sort of a free lunch stage in system development. There's all these nutrients, there's all this sunlight, there's all this water, there's all this open space. It's kind of chaotic. Whatever gets there, you know, gets a good deal. In the second stage, more things have been arriving, and there's a ratcheting up of competition. You've now got a whole bunch of things in there, and the early wave of things are actually getting kicked out, and they're getting squeezed, and a lot of tough plants are moving in. And you'll be getting maybe old-field goldenrod and dogwoods moving in the second stage. And in the third stage, the system is running into being populated with things that would pull in different directions. And the competition is so high that it can't sustain all these potential futures at once. So it's got some things maybe from a prairie growing in here, some things from a conifer forest, some things from maybe an oak forest, and it's getting pulled in different directions. But the system now says in stage 3, I can't be all these things. I have to be this, because this is my climate, this is the climate, these are the soils. So stage 3, actually there's a decrease in competition and an increase in cooperation internally within that system. And after these first 3 stages have occurred, the 4th stage, which I kind of call the harmony stage, which is a healthy functioning system that can continually improve and reproduce itself, takes over. So I know that's a lot of concepts quick, and I'm going to kind of lay these out. If you don't get, let me say, because I want to make the applications to you a little more clear in a lot of cases, I don't have as long to explain about the ecological phenomena, so if you feel like you're getting a short explanation on some things on the technical end, you probably are. Anyway, stage 3, so successional stages in nature. Stage 1, I mean, is chaotic and opportunistic. I call it kind of a free lunch stage. There's little cooperation, little competition among the species there. Stage 2, there's increasing conflict. Competition goes way up. There's very little cooperation. Stage 3 is a decision stage. It's narrowing. Some things get kicked out. Competition goes down. Cooperation goes up. Stage 4 is more of the harmony, old growth, balanced stage in which you have pretty low competition and pretty high levels of cooperation within that system. Okay, so this has applications in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of situations that you might encounter in life, but especially toward organizational formation. These are what the stages mean, in my opinion. So stage 1, this would be if you want to develop an organization. This is sort of a chaotic brainstorming stage. Let anything in. Let all possibilities in. Hey, it could be for profit. Could be part of a church group. Could be based on taxes. We could levy a new tax. We could have no money. It's just all, weekend work. Whatever it is. Be open-minded to all kinds of ideas. Don't worry if some of them are dumb or don't look right at first. So that's stage 1. Stage 2. Okay, I've gotten in all these ideas, but now it's time to be critical. Okay, what would it really mean to levy a new tax? Okay, what would I have to go through? What would it really mean to have my headquarters in Madison when my lake is over here? Okay, be critical. And the more honest you can be about how easy or how good or how difficult something will be, the better. In stage 3 of successional development, recognize, okay, I've been open-minded, now I've been critical, now I can't carry forth with all these things at once. I can't be a nonprofit and a for-profit. I can't have 2 headquarters, or whatever it is. So be honest and start to narrow down to what's optimal. And stage 4, that sort of harmony stage that I think we all want in many parts of our lives, that proceeds after the first 3 have occurred. And your odds of getting there are higher by going through those first 3 stages. Of course, stage 4 is not like lay down and rest and everything's taken care of after that. Some of us have found out the hard way in many parts of our lives. So, okay, so a little bit related to that, under forming an organization, stage time in nature. So you have those 4 levels. Well, you have these, you have these 3 decision-making processes before you can, get to this point of things functioning well. Yeah, but the really cool thing is that, like this stage 1 is about 2 years, 2 or 3 years in nature. And stage 2 might be 20 years, and stage 3 another 40, and stage 4, 5,000, it depends on the situation. So stage 4 is far, far longer than these other 3 stages. So it's not to think of going through these 4 stages, it's not just to put yourself in pain. It's to get somewhere, a value that should be lasting. Of course, there's context too, and your context could change and throw off some of your plans, but that's kind of a separate topic. Okay, so I kind of just went over this anyway. So your likelihood of, again, of getting to that 4th stage is higher by going through those first 3 stages because you have the correct things with you when you arrive, or the optimal things with you. Okay, so operating an organization. When you have an organization, inherently, you make group decisions, right? Because if the group does something, it's one decision. Okay, this is inherent in any kind of organization, any kind of group. So let's see how decision making works in nature. Got some baboons here, starlings, and a couple killer whales. So we already talked about why animals would be in groups. And to understand their decision making, so let's go back to the group idea. So animals gather together in groups for the benefits, and when the group isn't so beneficial, they break up. So for a group to stay together, for a group to be sustainable, it has to provide enough benefits to the members. Okay? So for a group to be sustainable, it has to provide enough benefits relative to the costs of the members. So some water buffalo. So it goes therefore that a group decision that's sustainable provides the most possible benefits and the least possible costs. If your group decisions can't do that, it will eventually lead to dissolution of the group, according to this model at least. So, okay, so a sustainable group decision has to be good for these animals, or else the group will break up. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, for these individuals to be benefited by a decision, that decision has to be true to what's happening on the ground. So if the decision is about, you know, where the predators are or where water is, it has to be true. You know, if water's to the east, the decision can't assume that water's to the west, right? And it also has to, that a good decision or a sustainable group decision also has to account for the status of the individuals, right? It can't ignore it, because those individuals, they'll leave if it doesn't account for their status. Okay, so a sustainable group decision has to account for the facts on the ground and the status of the individuals, and it has to connect them to a good strategy. And I think of this like a triangle. So a sustainable group decision has to incorporate the facts, the status of the individuals, and has to have a good strategy for bringing those forth, for connecting them to a common desired future, is another way to say it. If you can't connect this triangle, that's bad for the group, and it makes the group unsustainable. All right, so, well, that's interesting perhaps. Let me back up a little bit. So now that you know what makes a sustainable decision, you've got these animals here. Who should make that decision? Which one of them? Which of these water buffalo is the most capable of connecting the facts on the ground with the status of the individuals and to a good strategy? Which one of them is best? Well, maybe there's an elder there, one who's actually lived longer and knows more because they've lived longer, they've seen more. So it might be this, maybe this one in front is a leader or an elder, who knows? Or maybe there's a few mothers in there, you know, that are really always watching their offspring, and they're aware, they're more social, they're more aware of what's happening with others. So maybe it's a couple of the females or something like that. Or maybe it's one who's really strong, who knows, well, if we encounter some predators, I'm going to be the one who has to face them, and I know what I can handle. Or maybe none of them knows. Maybe none of them really knows enough about the other, and so they all have to collectively make a decision together, like, well, we're going to lean this way, no, let's lean this way, or we'll go this way. So in a small group, a sustainable group decision can come from one individual. It can come from a couple of individuals. It can come from all of them. It's not random, though. It can't just come from any of them at random. It has to come from the combination that can form the strongest triangle here. So let's see how this works in big groups. Okay, so you've got caribou migrating across the tundra, and there are hundreds of them, actually probably thousands. So now you've got the same triangle. They have to connect this triangle with the status of the individuals, facts on the ground, and a good strategy to make that group sustainable. So how do they do that? Well, maybe there's an elder here. Maybe that elder is smarter than the others. But there's a problem with that idea. In big groups, there's an elder here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. You don't have one elder. And maybe there's a few social individuals that kind of watch out how others are feeling. But there's not just a few, there are going to be dozens. And none of them can individually track how 1,000 other caribou are doing. So in big groups, the math changes. And this triangle cannot be connected appropriately in big groups by a few individuals, and decisions have to become collective. So what works in small groups, decision making, often does not work in large groups. So operating an organization, implications of this for decision making, an optimal decision correctly connects the facts on the ground, the status of the people to a desired future. If it can't do that, the organization, maybe not immediately, but will tend to begin to break up. In small groups, roughly less than 150 people, this can be done through a variety of ways, whatever's most appropriate. But in large groups, over about 150, this needs to become collective. And there is such a thing as representation in nature, but it's rare. And I'm not going to go over it, but it also can be involved in decision making.
Steve, can you clarify, go back to that slide, and just, you mentioned status of the people. Or before in the triangle, it's just the status of the individuals in an organization. Give a quick summary of what you mean by status. Are you talking about
I'm sorry.
Elder? Or are you talking about this idea that some are hungry and some are thirsty?
Yes, some are hungry, some are thirsty. The status is how are you feeling? Not only that here the lake is over here and the lake's polluted. How do you feel about it? Do you care about the fishing here? That kind of thing. That's your status, is your perspective on it.
To your last point, in the human world, we tend not to organize that way when we get very, very large. We tend to be representative, right?
Yes.
Or even sometimes single person.
Right. Hierarchical.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you talk about that? How
I could, and how about after?
Okay.
So there's a lot of issues that arise when you start looking at how this applies to our current systems. to put it small. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay. I know a lot of you are from northern Michigan. It sounded, or Wisconsin, but does anyone know what these are? See black walnuts. Yeah, see these on the ground this time of year. They're a little bit bigger than golf balls. And so here's a kind of a mature black walnut tree and some younger ones kind of in its canopy there. So I want to speak a little bit about rates of accomplishment, because as organizations, you're looking inherently to change some things. I mean, your directive is, well, maybe it's to maintain some things, but even that's changing things because you see some bad things coming and you want to maintain good things, or you want to make things better. So you want things to be changed. So how does change work in nature? This walnut tree started when a little female flower was pollinated by a walnut pollen grain. And then it grew gradually on the tree branch, and then gradually the stem connecting that walnut hardened and loosened, and the walnut fell down. And then a squirrel came along, and most likely a squirrel came along, picked up the walnut, buried it for its winter food supply, and didn't remember where it was, or got killed during the winter and never dug it out. So the walnut sprouted, you know, over a few weeks in the spring, and then it stood there all summer, and then in fall its leaves gradually wither, and then they drop down, and then it goes through the same process. It greens up and in spring, and then its leaves turn brown in the fall, and it does this over and over. It goes through seedling, small sapling, larger sapling, pole tree, young adult, mature adult. This is sort of almost a mature adult tree. And then it will go into aging tree. And eventually what often happens, especially like this tree grew out in the open, it's got these lateral lower limbs, and that will get knocked off, most likely eventually during a heavy winter storm. And there will be rot where that branch comes off. Rot will start to get into the trunk, and over maybe 3 decades or 5 decades, it just depends. The tree will start to hollow out, and then there will be some other big windstorm or something, and eventually the tree will lose more branches and go down, or the whole tree will go down at once. And that whole thing, it depends. Again, there are a lot of factors. This tree might live 150 years total. So if including all its seasonal changes, from very beginning of being pollinated all the way up till the time it dies, it has over maybe 300 plus significant life changes it's gone through. And out of those maybe 310 or 315 major changes, about 5 of them were quick, like falling off the tree, like getting blown over at the end of its life. And the rest were bit by bit. Took days, weeks, or years. And wherever I look at natural systems, I see that theme is everywhere. Almost all the change is gradual. Now, a lot of the change that's remarkable to us, you know, we might see a film of a lion catching a zebra or something, and gives us the impression that all these things just are like going crazy out there. Most things are gradual, bit by bit. And in doing anything related to conservation, we're inherently trying to turn around a momentum that has been building up to destroy the environment over thousands of years. And this change, it inherently cannot be quick. So understand, I think it's important, if you want to plan on sustainable changes, I think slow changes are more likely to be sustained than quick. If you go too quick in some things, you end up with backlash anyway. You get yanked back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back sometimes. So get rich slow. Okay, a couple things about larger forces at work, maybe to give some perspective. You're working conservation, and it's a tough, and I know that's not all you're doing. I know there's you're working on a lot of different issues, but especially the conservation aspect I'm thinking of now. I just want to point out a couple things for your perspective. This forest on the left is a healthy oak forest. The trees have some space between them, which is how a healthy sort of sustainable oak forest is. And the woods on the right, this landowner, he cut down all his trees at once, and then they all grew back. They're all growing back into pole trees. And the trees on the left have ample space. They'll be able to drop a lot of acorns every year. They're not threatened by being shaded out, you know, in extremely stressful competition. The trees on the right are in such tight competition that none of them are going to thrive. They're all going to be struggling, and it's going to be years. The only way they're going to get through this is by killing some of each other off, and then some of them will finally have a little bit of breathing room. And nature tends to create systems on the left. It doesn't tend to create sustainable systems that I described, that, like the one on the right. It creates systems where the individuals actually feel a sense of that they can express themselves reasonably. Maybe not fully all the time, but to a reasonable degree. And we're on a planet where I think a lot of this is happening, this stuff on the right. This is happening with people. All right, we're being squeezed in. If you look at the population level of just the US, it's distressing comparing maybe when you were born to the population now. It's either doubled or tripled in your own lifetime. So what's happening, and people are being squeezed, and it's affecting us subconsciously, and it's hard. But my point isn't to make you feel bad about that now. It's to say, even though I think you're in a struggling situation in many cases, I think you're going to be on the side of history that wins out. I don't think people or nature will allow us to remain in that choked manner. I think people will be driving toward a sort of a level of sanity and peace and environmental harmony in their lives. So I think you're working on the right side of things, even if you have some losses that, you know, are in your near future, you know. All right, another thing for your perspective, for the kind of topics you're working on, influence in nature. So these are little tussock sedges. Each one of these is a mound that's underwater at the edge of a lake, and we call it tussock sedge. And these sedges are part of a wet meadow, which is part of a lake. And this lake is part of a glaciated kind of wetland and oak forest landscape in southwest Michigan. And that's part of maybe the Great Lakes continental climate area. And we have, in nature, we have what's often called nested hierarchies. So there's little things inside a bigger thing, and then those are inside of a bigger thing, which are inside of a bigger thing. So these little sedges, each one of them is within the wet meadow, and that wet meadow is part of a lake, you know, so you can keep stepping up. But influence in nature, you have these nested hierarchies, and influence in nature is lopsided. It's not even. So if the lake rises by a couple feet, maybe there's a beaver builds a dam at the outlet, or something gets plugged or something, and the water level rises, all these sedges can be killed at once. Or if the lake has some catastrophic drawdown, or some zealous farmer drains out the lake or something, all these sedges can also be killed by this lake, by the lake activity all at once. And yet, one of these sedges trying to grow, you know, kick the lake, grow a little faster, grow slower, keel over, die, the lake doesn't notice anything about what one of these sedges is doing. So influence in nested hierarchies is often top-down, and that's just the way it works. And I want to, you know, I want to give that for an understanding of what you'll be subjected to. On the one hand, your fish are being subjected to that, right? As you make management decisions about lakes or rivers, these fish are living in that water. They can't get out of it. There they are, and you're affecting thousands of these fish at once. And yet there, the national government or the state government, one stroke of a pen and, you know, oh, there's my whole crew, here's my whole work, you know. So that's how these hierarchies work. But the empowering thing is lower levels can influence higher levels in nature when there's many individuals acting in tandem, in unison or persistently. So if all these sedges die at once, it will hugely affect the lake. You'll get all this mud moving around. It will greatly affect the chemistry of the lake. Or if they all grow more, you know, it affects the chemistry of the lake. So by acting all in groups at lower levels, that's how you have to often influence higher levels in hierarchies. Just for perspective. And I say that in part because, you know, you've all realized, yeah, you work for this lake, but now all of a you want this lake, something or other, now all of a sudden you've got this whole watershed to worry about. Now you've just gone up a level. And now here you are, one little person, and now you're looking at a whole watershed. So just to give perspective on that. So, anyway. Okay, in the last group of things, management and innovation, you hear a lot, we hear about sustainability, and we also hear a lot about resilience nowadays. So resilience is generally understood as the ability to withstand changes without losing your footing or without losing your mission or getting knocked down completely. So let's talk about how that works in nature. This is a healthy beech maple forest. If I went in there as an ecologist, I could make a list of plants in this area we're looking at, and I might have 40 species at this time of year. Okay, I have my list of plants. And then if somebody came and cut all these trees down and just left them laying, or if the windstorm came and knocked all the trees down, and I went back into this patch of woods after 3 years, I would find all these other things. I'd say, okay, oh, I didn't know there were raspberries here, and grapevines, and bottlebrush grass, and white vervain. You know, I start finding all these things like, wow, I didn't know they were here. I didn't see them before. And the truth is, I didn't see them because they were mostly living as seeds or in dormancy. In many cases, but nature will use these plants to help kind of heal and hold back other stuff while it regrows new trees. So it's using these things for its resilience, but it doesn't have those outgrowing all the time. It just has those in waiting. Should the need arise, these plants can kind of come to the rescue and hold the fort down until the trees come back. So the lesson, I think, for organizations is sometimes you'll hear about, oh, you need to be diverse. Diverse this, diverse that, to be resilient. And I think a lot of that is misunderstood about how that works. So you don't necessarily maybe want to, you know, join the circus and sell hot dogs and be a lake organization and, you know, be for-profit computer sales, and yeah, that will make me that will make me resilient. It's more that if conditions change, I can adjust. And if you can anticipate those conditions ahead of time, you'll be better off. If there are some things that take time to prepare for, you know, so the same way, if people know a hurricane's coming, they have more time. But if they also look ahead and say, I live in a hurricane zone, I'm going to do stuff years ahead. Not the big deal stuff, but I'm just going to have the things ready so that when it comes, I can do what I need to do. So those things will make you resilient. Pattern mimicry. So there's a lot of opportunities as you're an organization, here you are meeting. There are many opportunities in our lives to do certain things better than we do. And so we can look at that in nature. On the left is common milkweed, and on the right is dandelion. And both of these plants use this kind of similar method. They attach these cottony threads to their seeds, and the wind blows their seeds all over the place to disperse the seeds. And as I learned it in school anyway, dandelions are thought to be a little further along, a little more advanced in the evolutionary chain than milkweeds. So they maybe evolved later in time. Milkweeds are maybe a little more primitive on the scale of things. Doesn't really matter much, but so the dandelions, did they look at and they're trying to figure out how am I going to disperse these seeds, did they look at milkweeds and say, well, blowing them out in the wind would be a really good idea, except milkweeds do that. Look how those primitive guys do that. I don't want to do that. That's not right. I need the advanced thing. Nature is full of things that seem to copy each other, and it doesn't. There is no primitive or advanced really. If something works, it works. Period. So it's hard to be open-minded. And I was thinking the other day, sometimes like if on the basketball court I saw some guy I really didn't like do some move, it would almost make me not want to do that move, you know. But you got to overcome that bias. Say, okay, or maybe Shell Oil does this certain thing with their employees, and well, maybe I don't like Shell Oil because they sell petroleum products or whatever. But they do this really smart thing with their employees, and you can learn from that. So wherever you can get tips, it might be so-called primitive people about the way they raise their kids. Be open-minded to who you can learn from. Because there's a good chance that something you're wanting to do better has already been figured out by somebody else in some other setting. Okay, so as a lot of you operating organizations, you have a lot of opportunities to decide how you're going to manage things and to have a strategy how you're going to try and get from point A to point B. And the same thing occurs in ecosystem restoration and management. So I'm an ecologist. I could walk in, these are both wooded areas, and the woods on the left is in pretty good shape. This mostly white oak there, oak hickory woods. If someone asked me to go in and diagnose that site, I'd say, okay, yeah, it needs some fire because ash trees are moving in and the white oaks are getting a little crowded. And these oak forests do a lot better with fire than without, periodically. And I could accomplish that with a crew of 2 or 3 other people in about a day or two. Maybe a total of 40 hours of work a year. Maybe this 100-acre oak woods I could manage, do a pretty good job and make it looking really good. And on the right there is garlic mustard. That's an invasive plant species. It's an herb from Europe. And if I walked into that woods and the ground cover was filled with garlic mustard, and someone said, okay, what do you need to do to deal with this? I'd probably say, well, I need a crew of 2 or 3 other people for about 1 month every spring. I need maybe 300 or 400 hours per year. So the situation on the left, I needed 30 or 40 hours to improve things. The situation on the right, I need 300 or 400. And the difference is on the left side I'm managing a system, and on the right side I'm managing individual components. And so this is the difference between micromanaging and not micromanaging. And some, I think, micromanage if I can use it without much bias. Sometimes you need to. But if you don't have to, don't do it. It requires way, way more work and is ultimately almost impossible to sustain. So however you can position yourself or your organization to be not managing every single detail of something, right? Imagine if you wanted to improve the fish populations and you had to go catch fish and try and get them to breed together, and now try and keep others away so that their babies could grow up or something, right? You don't want to do that. You want to manage for a healthy lake, and the fish will figure it out from there, right? But we run into this with each other and how we deal with other people, or, you know. And finally, last point, I wanted to talk, these are wolves. They're not actually in Isle Royale, but I wanted to talk about something on Isle Royale. Because you have, as an organization, you have a lot of chances to take actions, and then, and then you have to figure out what to do after you take actions, because you're trying to get somewhere. And on Isle Royale, Isle Royale is an island, and probably most of you know this, in Lake Superior. And moose migrated to that island around 1900. And then I think around 50 years later, wolves got there on their own. And it's a big island, and biologists were really excited because they had this perfect setup. You know, they had been talking about and espousing about how this is the interaction of predators and prey, and this is the carrying capacity. And they said, okay, now that the moose are on Isle Royale and the wolves are here too, there's going to be this many moose, there's going to be this many wolves, and they're going to reach this harmony. And we know it's going to happen because we've learned a lot. We're really smart. We're scientists, and which is, well. But they did a really good thing. They said, well, we know it's going to happen, but we're going to study it to verify. So they studied what happened, and the wolf numbers went up for a while, and they were predicted to, I think, stabilize at 25, but they went under 25, and then up above it, and then down below, and the number of moose was going down, and then up and down, and both these populations are like going, whoa, all the time, back and forth. And I think in 1990 there were 50 wolves, you know, twice as many as they thought, and by 2 years later there were 16 or so, and now there are 2, and they're about to die off from the island. Really, the last 2 can't even breed together, it doesn't look like. So they might bring some more in. But the lesson here is, no matter how smart you are, even smart and experienced, these are complex systems, and we never really understand them as well as we think we do. So when you take an action, it's a great chance to say, okay, I'm going to watch what happens. I told this to my kids, you know, or whatever, and this is what happens to me. I told my kids this. I'm going to watch for a week. I'm going to see if there's any behavior change, you know. And then I'm going to kind of go from there. I don't know what I'll learn. I might find that what I did was not successful, and I'm going to try something totally different. Maybe it is successful, but I'm going to keep watching. So in any management of any systems, especially with people and your complex political situations, continue to watch the effects of what you do. You can learn so much sometimes by not just listening to what somebody says is a good idea, but watching what happens when you try something, and then revising your strategy, and then learning again after you watch that new strategy at work, and continuing to do that. So in ecosystem management, it's called adaptive management. And that was all the topics I wanted to go through. And I don't know about the time. I didn't.
No, we have time for questions
okay.
too, but let's show our appreciation real quick for Steve.
Okay.
And yeah, I think we have plenty of time for questions. Let's see, John.
Steve, would you put that last slide up? Thank you. Just for a second. I don't write that.
Oh, yeah, no.
And we can share these slides, obviously, by email out with all of you, too. So if you felt like you didn't get the notes, you'll
Definitely. Yeah.
I guess one of my questions is, Steve, this is a talk that I've noticed you gave twice now, versions of this at the Stewardship Network conference. Have you heard from people later on kind of getting back to you saying either they're stuck on something or they're very appreciative of something? Is there any, how do you connect this back, or have you had a chance to connect some of these to your life or your work in the firm that you work for? How
Yeah.
do you kind of real world test these?
This is, that's a good question. So for a bunch of years, I was kind of hermited down trying to do all this writing and organize this model, you know, and put it into a book and get the book out. And last year, I got that out. I had already given a couple sort of smaller talks at the Stewardship Network conference about it. And so I think probably I think less than 100 books have sold. So I don't know where it's going to go from here. I have not gotten a lot of like feedback at this point from people, say, applying something and then coming back to me and saying, you know, how does this work or whatever. But I would, you know, I'd like to get to that point and hear back from more people. Maybe people have read the book or seen a presentation or tried to apply it. And this model and this way of understanding things has affected me a great deal. The things that I thought I knew, like, you know, I went through school. I thought I'm smart, I can do this, I know that. And when, you know, putting the model together, I was like, I didn't get that. I didn't know that. And it wasn't until I translated things out that it's like, oh. And like that group decision making, I was a terrible group decision making type person because I'm not real social. You know, I'm not into talking a lot. And I thought, well, I'll figure out what to do and I'll do that. And now I know, and I see like these in the company I work for, I see a lot of these problems, and I know exactly why now I'm seeing problems, because I'm so familiar with these patterns now, and I see it going wrong, and I see what happens. And so when I get chances, I bring up. I don't talk about it through this lens of the book, but I say, well, I think we need to talk more about that because those people don't know what these people know, and they need to. You know, it'll be simple things like that, but I can see it clearly now. It's affected me a lot with the way I deal with my kids on a lot of things. I talk about complex system management, a teenager, right? It gives perspective. And also in watching the news. A lot of this falls into place now, and I used to be really kind of agitated and like, you jerk, you know, why, you know, all this. Now I'm like, okay, they don't understand this yet, or it's nice to see this working right, or this is a natural outfall of that. No, I'm not surprised this kind of went wrong. So it's helped me a lot.
John?
I really enjoyed the presentation and generally agree with it. My problem is human beings and their desire for power and greed influences things, and so there are real fast changes based on benefits to a very few individuals. And without going any further on that, as a person who is sort of pro-nature, trying to work for slow change, I sometimes feel you got to be real careful you don't get steamrolled by current fads that might benefit someone else, whether it's economic profit or they get to run their wave riders around the lake a little more often, even after dark, whether it's illegal or not. So I think we have to be careful to protect ourselves, as you said, from the short-term changes and be aware that everybody doesn't think like us in this group of the choir. There's other choirs out there. There's other audiences out there that have a completely different agenda. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying if we want to have our ideas prevail, we have to be really open to having better slogans and trying to work harder to enlist all the neutral people. And there are a bunch of neutral people, the so-called Great American Middle, that we don't do real well at influencing at times. I don't mean any of this in a negative fashion, or I'm not overwhelmed by it or pessimistic about it. And yet, at the particular moment, I guess maybe I'm just a little pessimistic about it. History ebbs and flows, and as you said, you go one step forward and two steps back frequently. I was trained as a historian in school, but then I see patterns where you go one step forward, maybe 3 or 4 steps back, then you never quite recover for quite a long time. So we have to be, I think, very careful to keep looking at the long term and not be overwhelmed by the short-term setbacks.
Right. I think that's a good point. Our lives are going to be a small segment if this planet is being turned around in a number of ways, environmentally and consciously, and how people treat each other. You know, there's a lot of things that are going to have to work together at the same time. Our lives are going to be a little segment on that long turnaround, and it could be very easy to see it as a negative, but we're making it more positive more quickly than it would be otherwise. But yeah, I struggle with that as well. Sorry. Yes, please.
All these different scenarios that we went through, both with people and animals, okay, I kind of look at 2 different sizes. One example would be the federal government, where you've got checks and balances, executive, legislative, and judicial. Not all 3 at the same time are working on the same thing, nor are they getting anything accomplished at the same time. Then you look at what we deal with a lot of time is lake groups, lake association groups, where there may be one person that's the head of the group, and he or she is the head of that group because nobody else wants to do it. Okay, but whatever that person says, the others follow. Okay, and sometimes they're made up for social reasons, and sometimes they're made up for being more productive reasons, taking care of the lake. How do you get, and I've dealt with mine, and I tried to push a little bit too hard the first time, and I wanted to get one of these samples done that shows red, yellow, and green at each property owner and how they're taking care of their lake frontage. And the person in charge said, no, we're not going to do that. He didn't consult with the rest of the board. He just said, we're not going to do that because we don't want to upset anybody. So I had to step back, and earlier this year I said, hey, how about there's a guy that does Secchi readings 4 times a year, same spot, you know, basically the same part of the day and that stuff. He's very good at it. He's been doing it 2 or 3 years. He likes doing it. And I said to him, I said, we got 4 different water sources coming into the lake. We're not phosphorus heavy, but we are nitrate heavy and other things. And he gets the thing, and he gives a speech at our lake association every year. And he said, yeah, we are. And I says, why don't we next summer do additional ones at each one of those in sources, which we have 4. And he thought that was a pretty good idea. Then it's how to pay for it. And I said, you know, look, you take where Squaw Creek comes into Squaw Lake, I'll pay for that one. If it takes 4 extra tests, I'll pay for that one. Maybe somebody else will. And maybe we got enough money in the dues for the other 2. Well, so we're going to end up doing that next year. But I had to really go backwards from where I wanted to get. Now, maybe eventually I'll get those picture things done of each land owner on the lake. But the principal, the president of the organization said, well, why do we want to do that? And I says, well, we got to have a base to start from. And I said, this is going to be in the lake records. We're keeping lake records by year now. And I says, we need to upgrade this so we got a basic of starting. If this lake or this stream coming in from Fuller Lake is just laden with nitrates, we need to know that. There may be nothing we can do about it. But how does all this add into the dynamics of working with lake associations, which we do a lot of? Is it easier to work with a smaller group, or is it easier to work with a larger group?
So that's a good question. What part of an outfall, so in the very first topic I went over with grouping, whether the group is a good idea or a bad idea. The more individuals are similar, the more cohesive a group will tend to be, and the easier it will be to keep it together. And
Speak up, please.
yes, I'm sorry. The more individuals are similar, of a similar mindset, value system, background, understanding, whatever it is, the more cohesive a group will tend to be. And the more diverse those members, when it comes to their reason for grouping, the more diverse they are, the harder it may be to hold that group together. So it can be really tricky. So so that book has 44 patterns, and these all intermingle and kind of work together. And I could pull in some of these other patterns and how they interact and interweave with what we're talking about. But there's not really necessarily more difficulty with a smaller or a bigger group. It's more of how unified they are. And you want those decisions to represent, to be equal to the truth for those group members to the degree possible. And it sounds like when you have a manager who just makes a decision without consulting, that's a good example of maybe poor group decision making. If he wasn't well situated, if he wasn't well informed enough to make that decision and he made it, that's not, I would recommend against doing that. Does that help?
Yeah, that's why I went to the second guy, because I would probably got the same results from the president.
Yeah.
This way, going to the guy that actually does the water testing and that kind of stuff worked out a lot better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you probably said this earlier, or maybe someone else did. Your association with the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources, did you have one?
I never have worked for U of M. No, I worked, for 3 years, I worked for what's called the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, which is part of the extension, MSU extension, Michigan State University extension.
Right, Lansing.
Yes.
I was just wondering, well, U of M has, well, it's been rated as the best sociology department in the country and therefore the world, since it's sociology. I was just wondering if you'd run this MSU, they aren't slackers either. Have you run it by any people in sociology departments, any professors, your model?
Not to my knowledge.
It could be useful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the, yeah, thank
I
you.
want to go back to the point too that Dave brought up about sort of the groups and your response about sort of group similarity, and speak to sociology a bit. Aaron Thompson's going to join us this afternoon. He is sort of a resource sociologist working at Stevens Point, and part of what he's been able to do, he's been working with a couple of lake groups around the state, but I can just bring up one in particular. I think, Buzz, you're familiar with this one. It's in, I want to say it's on the Polk County, St. Croix County border. It's the one, we have a lake leader out there on the lake, and they were getting involved in a pretty protracted lake management planning effort. Is it Bass Lake? And Aaron did a survey of sort of the property owners in Bass Lake, the shoreline property owners. And they just kind of went into it saying, hey, we just want to get a gut check of where do these property owners see the issues on this lake. So he had drafted up, working with some folks, sort of a list of possible issues and wanted to query them and then use some analysis techniques to do sort of like audience segmentation. Like what are the different factions that exist on this lake? And the largest faction was essentially a group of people who are largely based out of the Twin Cities, who come to the lake just on weekends. And when they come to the lake on weekends, they just want to recreate. That's really all that they really care about. And they essentially perceived no problems with the lake. It was meeting all of their needs, and they did not even understand why they were going to be going into a lake management planning effort. And then there was a much smaller segment of people who were almost hyper concerned about the lake. They were very attuned to the ecological challenges, maybe the water quality challenges. They knew that there were these phosphorus and nitrogen inputs coming into the lake. They knew that the levels of maybe visitation to the lake opened it up to invasive species, and they were just sort of chomping at the bits. So it might sound familiar to some of the people in this room, right? But Aaron pointed out, like, you have this diversity or this schism almost amongst your lake, and if you think that somehow you're going to take this other 90% of people along with you, and that they're going to just sort of bloop, light bulbs are going to go off, and they're going to jump onto your ship, you're kind of delusional. You're a little bit misguided, and you're going to be frustrated if you go down that road. He was essentially, I think, trying to let them down a little gently and point out to them these factions that exist. And you can imagine, if you could get to a point in your lake where there is much more consensus or similar mindset about issues, then it is easier to talk about, hey, let's do this shoreline assessment, because everybody agrees that there's going to be some value, even if it's just in recording where you're at today, so that someone can do it 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and see where you're at. And I think you're right in starting with measuring maybe the nutrients in the streams coming in, saying, look, we're just trying to build up the complexity of our snapshot of the lake. We're starting here because it's maybe where there's at least consensus, or at least there's low barriers to moving forward. There isn't enough, the group leader isn't going to just cut us off and stop us from doing this, so we'll just operate in the domain that we can operate in. But I do think that part of why Extension still has this notion of, like, keep doing your newsletters, keep doing your web pages, keep holding your annual meetings, is that you have to have these opportunities to get the information out there and to potentially get people to sort of nod their head, or maybe the light bulbs go on. And it's not going to be all of them all at once. You said that it'd be really powerful if it could happen that way, if everybody changed their awareness all at once and started to shift in their direction. But it's most likely not going to happen. It's going to be gradual.
Yeah, I think maybe a more likely good outcome would be that enough people are turned one at a time, gradually, to a mindset at which there's the agreement toward an environmental or a sustainable planet overwhelms those that still don't care or don't agree at a certain point. We don't have to get every last person to agree with a pro kind of environmental agenda, but when they start to become a minority, it will be hard for them to operate workably in an environment when everyone else is not working the same way. Kind of like you can't all have a different kind of phone system that doesn't, interact right with each other.
Eric?
Brian?
The scenario you just described, it sounds to me like you're talking about incremental change of property owners and the like. Is this a new position for you folks? UW Lakes Extension Lakes?
A new position, meaning like
Well, okay, I'll go to the heart of it. I was browbeaten so badly by Bob Core, with my lake grants, management grants. Get everybody on board right now! And why are they all on board?
Oh.
And that was so defeating, because then a lot of energy goes down a rat hole. You know it's a rat hole. But when Porth is telling you this is the way it's got to be done, everyone has to be right in line right away. So I just want to know, what's the position? Are you guys incrementalists? Are you willing to do that? I agree with you, by the way, that that's the only way it can really be done.
Yeah.
But that's not what I was
I
saying.
guess I want to point at pattern 44 here, whether the person just shared with us.
Right.
You know, what we're actually doing, whether it's Korth giving you advice through lake leaders or through personal communications, or me doing that, or Kim doing that, or Pat Goggin doing that. We're also, believe it or not, you're all little guinea pig systems that we're trying to interact with. We're hoping that we're using sort of the Hippocratic Oath and we're not trying to break you or put anyone in personal harm, but we are testing out different ideas. And we can't help but be attuned to what's going on in social sciences and research of what is a sustainable organization and how do they function. And then we'll try and implement that into what we're doing. I think as we get into my little presentation, you might get a better sense then of how we're picturing these groups and why we're focusing on capacity building as sort of a concept and a program that we're going to be working on, and why the DNR agrees that it's a worthwhile endeavor to focus on capacity building rather than just communication blitzes, or even just the idea of like, oh, well, if we have 700 lake organizations today, then 10 years from now, don't we want 1,000? And then don't we want 1,200? Or the question of like at convention, every convention needs to have, you know, one year it's 500 people, the next year it's only successful if it's 550, and the next year it's only going to be successful if there's 600. Like, growth in numbers is okay, but maybe we need to start focusing on quality and managing sort of for quality rather than just sheer numbers. And Buzz, you might have a comment.
Well, going back to the Bass Lake example, I think that it was a huge learning experience building upon just what you're talking about, Steve. When these, you know, we thought that baby was really going to rock. We had 40 people show up at the first planning meeting, and what they didn't understand is everybody didn't think like they did. Mm-hmm. They were the choir. And if you read that plan, as it turns out, it's all about capacity building to accomplish change over time. Their lake, the big threat to their lake, it's an outstanding resource water that's approaching a threshold change where it will exceed water quality standards. And so they didn't get rid of the biophysical chem science at all. They used that in their goal setting, where they set a water quality goal that was better than the water quality standard of that lake, because they know if the lake even went to the water quality standard for the lake, it'd be more degraded than it is today. So their approach is to create change with those in the choir first, and showing this is what it's going to take if we're going to protect the characteristics you value most. Because the thing across the board was everybody valued the same thing about Bass Lake, which was good water quality. But what that 50% didn't understand was the lake is not a static system. It's a dynamic system that's changing. And so they put a management strategy together that will create slow change over time. We'll save a lake.
Is that new, that you're thinking on that, the slow change over time?
Well, it's what's new about Brian is we use sociological data for environmental goal setting.
No, I understand, but I mean from your position, from Wisconsin Lake's position, as you work with the lake groups, are you more open to creating, you know, working with the people who are there, if you will, and expanding more incremental change?
Well, I think what we're doing, Brian, is learning about the people side of lake management and then bringing that into the policies and programs for management.
Right, I understand you've always been doing that.
No, we really haven't.
Oh.
We've been barely doing it.
Okay, because I remember one of the slogans early on was that lake management is really people management, and I learned that from you folks.
Yeah, we say it, and then we'll get a chance to kind of see what this looks like in the afternoon. It's another question to like drill into the details of exactly how to do that.
So you're
and it's a question of resource allocation. So if we say that it's people management, but then if we looked at the DNR's budget and say, well, you're still spending 99% of your budget on the geophysical sciences and the biophysical sciences, and you're spending a tiny amount on the social sciences, there's a disconnect there. And what we're trying to do is set the conditions to tip the scale a bit more towards investing in that social science and then carrying out that social
I
studies.
think that's great. I totally applaud that. I would also suggest within the realm of sociology, you can get a lot done by working on community organizing. There's a whole literature on that, and that could be real helpful too.
You're going to get a flavor of that this afternoon. Mike, you might have had a comment, and then Zach also. Yeah, you
No.
Mike.
Well, I think that my original question from a while ago kind of fits into what we've been talking about as far as we're sort of moving organizational change. So if you have, you talked about how in nature the caribou herd makes some sort of consensual decision. How do they do that? Like and how does that translate to a larger organization? Is it obviously the caribou don't all kind of, hold a powwow and vote and make a decision. Is it more of a group part of the herd starts doing something and some follow, and it's a constant push and pull, so there's never like a direct line, it's just kind of trial and error that moves them forward?
So, so like the technical question, how does this happen in biology? Like the group decision?
I think it's probably important to know.
Like animals, it's really, so group decision making, I synthesized a whole ton of stuff for you. It's been studied a lot, but it's one of the most difficult things to study in nature. And we tend to study the higher animals because they're a little bit more, they have a little bit more complicated behavior that we can interpret as being a decision. And so it varies by species, and sometimes one will stand up and like look in a certain direction, and for a certain amount of time that means I want to do this, and if another stands up and does the same thing, and if a third does, then the herd will agree and go. Other times, if animals in a group, a really large group, they can't all see what the other's thinking or doing, what it will be more in the outfall, like the caribou herd, it will be more leanings and pulling back, and then others seeing what the others are doing, and okay, no, we're slowing down, and I agree to slow down, and let's see what's going on here. And if they get to where some are pulling in a different direction hard enough from the others, they'll split up, So it's probably more by like observing their neighbors, walking and leaning, head leaning, things like that.
So how does that translate to larger organizational decision-making?
Okay.
From
right.
a statewide organization to a governmental body?
Right.
That doesn't seem to be the way.
Right. So we don't. Right. So it's such a neat area. Like knowing this, it's such a neat area to start thinking about in terms of, well, how have we been operating as a state government, as a community, as a national government, as the UN or whatever it is. And there is, like I said, there is an element of representation in nature, and it rarely happens because the requirements for representation are rarely met. And I don't feel like I have that I could go through that and fully explain representation. But most of the time, why would you want somebody to drive to Washington, D.C. and make a vote on something that is different than what you want? Why would you vote for someone to do that?
Efficiency.
Well, is it efficient to get what you don't want?
If
I mean,
in
how?
the long, I guess the argument would be, if in the long run, in the context of a single decision, no, but in the context of the full amount of decisions that have to be made,
Okay.
I can't go to Washington.
Right, many decisions have to be made. Do those decisions fairly, you think, represent you and fairly represent your community and the values that you hold?
There's a really glib answer to that.
Right, right. It has a swear and then ends with no.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right, so why would you want those decisions to be made supposedly on your behalf? So you have basically something that is completely non-functional almost occurring. So if it's true. I can't be physically everywhere deciding on where all this tax money goes and everything else. But if those decisions are going to be made, they ought to be made with respect, again, to the facts on the ground, the status of the nation, and how to get there. And they're not being made that way. And there's a lot of reasons they're not being made that way.
Well, my congressman's a good guy, but Mike's is a bum. Get rid of him.
Right, right.
But Mike thinks my congressman is a good person, and I should get rid of mine.
That's right.
That's it.
So this grouping issue, a lot of it, we could have a week or two to go through grouping and decision making, and I think you would all leave with a totally new understanding of how decision making does work now in America and how it could work in a working, more functional like America. So part of grouping and decision making is, are we aggregated under gun rights here? Do we have, okay, this room, are we here with a core value system for gun rights or not? Probably not. So why would our group try and develop a single group decision on gun rights? You know, for example, I'm just throwing that out there. It wouldn't really make sense. We're not aggregated around that issue. And if we talked, we find we might have, like, you know, a lot of difference of opinion on that topic in here. So do you want to send people to Washington to make group decisions for a country that's deeply divided? So it raises the issues of how can we group, and there's probably, we can't fix you know, you're going on a train that's going in the wrong direction, you can fix the chair you're sitting on. It doesn't really do any good. So we can vote for a different person in many cases, vote for a better person, donate money to a better candidate. But that's not addressing the system that they work inside, which actually, when you learn about it, in my opinion, in this system, the system doesn't make any sense. And when it was set up, the system made much more sense when it was set up, and it was the best understanding that people had at the time. But it was set up under conditions which are no longer true. There's a much more homogeneous group of people, much more similar status, a much smaller number of people in the 13 colonies, and it was easy to make a unit decision that was roughly representative of the status and values and context of those country landowners. That cannot be done anymore in many cases. So we need to identify what can that be done with, and what do we all have in common. That's a good starting point. It's a really complicated topic, and I think it's super valuable because we can't, all this other stuff we're doing and that I'm doing at my job and the regulations I work with at my company and all this, it's all going to be blown away by other bigger things that are totally messed up, right? Like if the climate goes way off, right, and we can't get hold of our emissions and all this other stuff, it's going to blow away a lot of the ecological work we do on the ground. So we got to keep sight of our daily job and our daily task, but understanding what's going to happen in these bigger systems and and then that's going to have to be tied into some other issues, which is going to be accountability, group survival. There's a whole lot of other issues that are going to come in, resilience, diversity. It's things I didn't really talk about today. But they're going to have to come in and be addressed if this whole thing is going to get kind of shored up in working in unison. The whole 800 years ago, 1,000 years ago, the whole planet had all these, there was the tall grass prairie, the mixed grass prairie, there was the the dune system, there was the Lake Michigan aquatics, there was, everywhere you go there's some other system. And those were all interacting and tied together, and they were all on a kind of a harmonized biosphere. And they were all kind of interacting through that. And this was one giant grand system that was very functional and very sustainable. So we will not be as complex, but we're going to have to do something that is also at the local, the medium, the national, and the global level, that all those patterns are going to have to tie in right. And everything's going to have to be pulled into line somehow. And not that there's one way to do that, but the things that are off, they're going to have to be stopped and changed.
Jack?
First of all, I love your model. My background is in ecology and environmental education, and I often look at nature and patterns and try to see what I could learn from that system. A couple of things that I think about in some of the work that we do is that first top of the pyramid, your individual status of how do you feel, I think is one of the biggest parts of this. Like, how do you communicate with your group? And I really think education is a huge aspect of all of this, because if you don't understand your lake classification, your lake system, you're not going to understand your water quality. If you don't understand your shorelines and the benefits of those plants, you're not going to understand why it's beneficial to keep them. And you know, we do a huge, through our department, a lot of education, and I think it's working for us of understanding why it's important to keep that, you know, large-leaf pondweed, because it's connected to fish habitat and all of that. And the thing that scares me the most of your model is this right here. To me, I see not adaptive management, I see reactive management happening, where, you know, the systems are changing so fast.
Yeah. With
climate change and your Royale Wolf connection, the ice bridge, you know, all of these things, that is really difficult.
It's making,
this
yeah,
entire model.
It's making it hard to take the time to focus on what happened, how is it working, how can I do it better. You're halfway done in that process and something else has come along and wiped it clean, and now you're like redoing something else. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and then reactive management to that.
Yeah.
And it might be wrong. Because we have the time.
Yeah, it is. It's really, I think it's really we're entering a challenging period on the planet. We just, for better or worse, here you are now. It's really, it's really hard, and you can set up that successional development. You could set up your system. I'm going to be, you know, go through all these stages and reach my harmony stage, and then the economy changes, you know, or then a new health challenge comes along, and these things get, we're getting pushed and pulled in a lot of directions. And even though that's true, I'm looking for something in this model. If this model, okay, if this model is just another stimulus to pull people in a new direction, it's going to fail. It's absolutely, I think people are way overstimulated. I know a lot of you are from a quieter part of the country, but you're probably feeling it here in your lives too, even no matter where you are now. But you know, the cities now, our kids in the schools, the amount of stimulation and the amount of things you're supposed to do and focus on is too high. What we need, what I'm hoping to do is ratchet things down. Okay, instead of trying 5 things and finding out 5 don't work, and then trying another 5 things, I'm trying to say, okay, let's be clear, let's do one thing that works. And now we've actually moved ahead a little bit. Let's do one more thing that works. And for something new to be built, which is that's going to happen on this planet, something new is going to replace the way things are now, because the way things are now is not sustainable. That means it's going to go away. So it's going to be awkward. I think, painful to see a lot of things break down, and we're seeing it in the news. But at the same time, your ability to rebuild something meaningful and understand and workable and functional is going to be really critical. Not just to be another contributor to all the chaos and problems, but you'll help to be kind of a resolver and a healer during this time. So I hope that I can contribute that element more than just, oh, here's more to do, more to think about.
What's the name of your book?
It's The Nature of Sustainability. And so the first, let me talk a little bit about this. It's 4 parts. The first part is kind of says things are getting really messed up. I kind of try and, you agree, but I mean, I try to convince just any, regular person, yeah, come on, this is not going well. Face it before it's, much more time elapses. And the second part of the book goes through, says, okay, well, things are messed up. We're smart, we're people, we're logical. We're going to be able to figure out how to fix them, right? You got a problem, you fix it. And so it spends about maybe 70 pages going through what happens if you think that you can figure out how to fix everything. And it kind of, in some ways it's a lot of detail, but it helps, I think, demonstrate that our cognitive capacities stretch to the limits of like developing, super duper computers. When it comes to managing free will and unplanned events and chaotic systems, we will not be able to figure them out in like the sense of I'm going to sit here and write down how they work, like a math problem. And so there's a lot of pages, and part 2 are dedicated to trying to demonstrate that as a theory, as part of the theory, why we need more. And then it goes into saying, okay, we're limited to how much we can actually directly figure out. But there is something that's working that works much better than we do. It's pretty consistent, and let's see what that tells us. And so that's the bulk of the book. And in the last part of the book it says, okay, well, let's go through a complex setting and see how these patterns would apply to the example is a village school. Okay, we're going to set up a school in a village. Let's see what sustainability patterns say about that. Would it be sustainable? And by the way, when I talk about sustainability, I didn't quite clarify this. Sustainability is taught as a little bit of a point of view issue now in the schools. It's kind of politics. Well, sustainability is you have to treat everybody fairly, and the economy should be this way, and and there's a lot of political perspective in there, and I think some of it's probably right and some of it's probably a little off, but I've tried to divorce the opinion as much as possible, and I'm sure I didn't all the way, but my definition of sustainability is something which can function and continue to function. So this book the intention is to provide an understanding of how sustainability works and unfolds regardless of what I want or what anybody wants. This is just nature saying, we've tried it for 1 million years, for 20 million years, this is what we keep coming up with.